Welcome everyone to BSMA's third in a series program regarding the impact of COVID-19 on life sciences. Today we focus these dynamics on the very integral part of supply chain called logistics. This Zoom event from Biosupply Management Alliance demonstrates our commitment to partnership with its members and colleagues, desiring to better support our industry and remembering that patients' lives matter. My name is Joel Glendy, part of a team of BSMA professionals, and I'm your host and moderator for today's virtual event. Now I'd like to introduce our five panelists, starting with Wahiba Hall. She's a global transportation leader for Bayer, and she's going to be covering the challenges and contingencies needed to thrive in this COVID environment. Our second panelist, Edward DiMartini, is a senior VP with Kuehne + Nagel. He's going to be covering freight capacity and demand fluctuations and different mitigation efforts shippers have been needing to solve in this condition we're in right now. And our third panelist is Jeff Tucker, CEO of Tucker Company Worldwide. He's going to be covering the North American trucking industry, where, as we call, where the rubber meets the road, and how truckers, owners, and related services have adapted to this new world that we're dealing with. Our fourth panelist, Larry Tillum from SkyCell, is the North American Business Development Director. He's going to be covering the dynamics of temperature management in this volatile period. And our fifth panelist is Laurent Kovacs. He's head of Schenker America's Vertical Healthcare Group. He's going to be covering the impact on carriers and related services and airports' effects on temperature managed services and transit times. So with that, I'd first like to start with Wahiba Hall. My first question for Wahiba is, please describe the landscape in our industry today, specific to logistics and transportation, that COVID-19 has impacted your businesses, and how have you adapted to these turbulent times? Wahiba?
Hi, Joel. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me and the team. I'm really excited to be here. Yes, well, it's not a secret. You know, this is, has impacted us as people with our families and friends, and just going through managing personal lives and working in an industry which primarily specializes in saving lives. And so I feel a great sense of responsibility and pride, especially working for Bayer. Bayer has demonstrated a great deal of innovation, flexibility in its supply chain since the pandemic started. We were very aware and very agile. Managing teams and different functions and different parts of the world is definitely become something that we all just wake up and do, and don't even ask ourselves questions of where is this person versus where is that person, and we try to come together pretty much and consistently deliver quality, compliant medical needs to our patients around the world. So it's not just a Bayer pain points that I'm going to go through. It's an industry series of pain points. We know that capacity has been stabilizing, but unfortunately prices have tremendously increased. So there's a financial impact, but more so we have been dealing with the issues in scarcity of temperature control active containers. Unfortunately, the repositioning of those sorts of equipment is not as well managed, I would say, in certain critical ports, and so we find ourselves having to move shipments from one day to another, just because there's not enough temperature control containers available. We have also, and this is something that's actually getting better, but still continues in some key ports, as in Asia, we have delays in customs inspections for time and temperature sensitive products. So the added, just the added time, we've had to make sure to include that in our transportation, our expectation for the product to arrive or to exit a key country. We also have had to deal with ever-changing regulations, especially for import and export of PPE. So this was, really, really critical at a certain point a few weeks ago. It's actually getting better, but still, very fluid, and very fast changing changes in regulations. And then, pretty much dealing with the saturation in some major trade lanes, like APAC to US and APAC to EU. So how have we been mitigating? We've definitely had to rethink our change management and making it more agile, and making sure that our transport teams, can make changes at the last minute in compliance with, all of the regulations and internal procedures. We've onboarded, additional carriers and freight forwarders just to make sure that there's additional flexibility. And the industry as a whole has been looking at joint chartering, to areas that are really hard to get flights in and out of. So that's pretty much how I think the industry has been reacting and becoming more agile and really thinking outside the box to deal with the demands globally. But at the end of the day, we have to say, though, that compliance, quality has always been the utmost priority for us. And so this is what we wake up to every day and what we want to deliver to the patient every single day. So thank you to everyone involved, from point A to point B and every handling party in between.
Very good, Wahiba. Thank you. Before we go to Edward, I do want to remind the audience that this roundtable is being recorded, and our agenda is very simple yet interactive. Each panelist is going to spend about 5 minutes on their key topic area, and we'll have follow-up questions after the initial foray. This should allow us to field questions from you, and then if you would, please submit them through the chat tool that's available, and we'll address them as we're able to. And lastly, we'll wrap up with any summary comments. With that, Edward, your section on freight capacity and demand fluctuations, people have been hearing a lot about this, but please help us understand this a little better. With these dramatic reductions in passenger air capacity, please describe what that impact has been in more detail and how shippers have been successful in their life sciences.
Sure. So from an impact of where it's really been felt, you're correct in terms of the passenger capacity that's been taken out of the market due to the international travel restrictions, as well as now what we're seeing, airlines are going into full-blown restructuring modes. And it's becoming more and more clear now that they're trying to position themselves to be anywhere from about 50 to 60% of what their size was pre-COVID-19. So this is not just from an aspect of parking aircraft, but from a retirement of aircraft, going to their employees and looking to have less pilots on board, less flight attendants and everything else. So the prevailing theory is that we're not going to get back anywhere to where we were for at least the next 2, maybe 4 years. And so that passenger capacity reduction has been felt tremendously within specific trades. And I think the pharma healthcare industry has probably been impacted greater than some of the other industries around the world, simply because a lot of pharma healthcare traveled across the transatlantic. It traveled from North America to South America and Europe to South America. And so from that perspective, when you looked at those trades historically, the transatlantic was roughly anywhere from about 60 to 70% dependent on passenger wide body. And the southbound trades were dependent almost 80% by passenger capacity. So when you look at some of the maps overall, you take that holistic number that right now we're at about 28% less global capacity than we were a year ago. It doesn't sound as bad. You focus on the transatlantic and it's off by 61% year on year. You focus on the southbound trades, it's off by 80% out of Europe, for instance, year on year. So it really has meant that not just our pharma and healthcare clients losing a lot of the opportunities to move that freight over legacy aircraft that used to be there on some of their heavier trade lanes, but it's also meant that now they need to look at some of their flows as well as to which airlines can handle it, but also are qualified to handle it as well. So what we've seen with a number of our clients has really been trying to adapt to this. And depending upon where the focus is, whether we're talking general cargo, dangerous goods, passive temp control, or active temp control, has really dictated where kind of that strategic focus is for the future. So one case in point, working with a shipper, was really looking at how we could ensure their supply chain continued to move by working with a specific airline on a direct flight option, and basically going out and getting what would be essentially a BSA, or a committed capacity, so that there would be that ability for freight to continue moving. We've also worked with a medical device organization to do something similar, but we've done so across a couple airlines where there's direct for something that may need a little bit more urgent shipment that week, or we're utilizing a transshipment, for instance, into Europe, where we can direct the flows as they go. But what basically we're kind of seeing out of this, and that steps in the future, is that the networks are going to be much smaller. So your options are going to be less. So I kind of always have used the example, American Airlines used to have a flight, Chicago to Krakow, Poland. That's not coming back, not anytime soon. And instead, the airlines will focus on the gateway to gateway moves, which means that you're now going to have more shippers trying to go out or into the same airport. And at the same time, you've got to look at what could be referred to as your tail, your random one-off lanes that weren't real heavy, but consistent. And they may be going into markets like Eastern Europe or somewhere else outside of some of the legacy gateways in South America, where you now are going to have to look at remodeling that through a gateway. And then how do you get that freight into the end final mile delivery?
Right.
So there is an opportunity in that, though, to model out how you would take your heavy gateway to gateway flows, bring your tail into that to try to leverage both to get some form of stability, both in rates, but also in the capacity for the assurance of supply.
Very good. Yeah, this is very challenging. Use of gateways. Let's switch gears, going with Jeff Tucker's area. And Jeff, with all the volatility we're seeing now in other modes of transport, how has this impacted road transport in North America? And what are you seeing? And please describe the current state for the trucking industry, including supporting last mile needs.
Thanks, Joel. The trucking is experiencing a similar significant disruption, I think. you don't have to look too much further than we've got, what, 39 million people unemployed. Those 39 million people are not buying in the same quantities as they were buying before, right? Because they're saving money. Those folks who are employed are cautious. They're not going out as nearly as much. No one's spending money on planning their summer getaways, and so there's quite a bit of curtailed spending. And when we stop spending and we stop buying things, there's not enough things for trucks to move. First of all, I'd like to give a shout out to the truck drivers, because as a lot of us were sheltering in our homes and home restricted, these folks were going right into the heart of the storm. We were involved in trucking companies moving freight into New York City, medical supplies into New York City, food and other supplies, and you really had the cream of the crop, the best of the best in selfless individuals wanting, not solemnly agreeing, but wanting to deliver into these areas. Now, so want to shout out to them. So the first couple of weeks into the pandemic, that's when we were buying lots of toilet paper and all these things, and the replenishment surge that was required to kind of keep up with. People were trying to get their last minute things, through the supply chain, and then there's that replenishment that was crazy, to say the least. Bolstered trucking, the industry, especially if you had some sort of exposure to those kind of customers. But since then, it has really just nosedived in terms of the available freight. The spot market is like almost non-existent, and it comes at this event comes, not that you ever would plan or want for such an event to occur, but within the trucking economy and the trucking demographic, it came at the worst possible time. So what do I mean by that? We just had the longest economic recovery in the nation's history. It was steady, reliable, modest, but it was long. And in that time period, we added about 1 million net, 1 million additional drivers to the for-hire fleet. We have just before the virus hit, we had about the highest number of trucking companies in business. 248,000 trucking companies in business, nearly 3 million drivers, nearly 3 million tractors. So, and you could feel, I think just about every shipper on the call, every provider on the call could feel that in 2019, things were softening a little bit. Shippers had maybe the upper hand in pricing because there was this huge expansion in the number of trucking companies and drivers. So rates began kind of softening, and you could feel it in 2019. So you were left with, at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, this overabundance of drivers, overabundance of carriers. We were probably still at a supply-demand equilibrium nationwide. There were pockets here and there that were having trouble, but then the virus hits and industry mothballs, and you've got the historically highest number of drivers and trucking companies ever looking for freight that just flatly isn't there. So rates have gone down pretty dramatically. Just in the last couple of weeks, we're starting to see the spot rates up. DAT, I believe, said they were up about 12% from their earlier lows in March. So we're starting to see a dig out, but there's a heck of a lot of casualties along the way. And I think I agree with Edward that we're 2, 3, maybe 4 years away from seeing freight volumes where they were just 4 months ago.
Wow. That's going to have quite an impact on the owner operators and a lot of different dynamics here over the next few months, especially if things start ramping up rapidly.
Yeah, you know,
States, it's going to be availability, right?
it is, and that's really what. And so it's bad for the owner operators. But news broke yesterday of a roughly 1,000 truck operator filing for Chapter 11. So, you know, it doesn't matter how well you run your business if there's no freight to move and you've got people to pay. You know, this is going to be an extremely long, difficult, challenging event for everyone in freight. Now, that said, that said. If there is a shakeout and if the economy comes back in something like a hockey stick fashion, which I'm not predicting, but I'm not a predictor, uh, uh, you know, it could have a extremely detrimental effect on pricing for shippers, meaning prices will go maybe to historic highs.
Got it. Very good. We're going to switch gears a little and get closer to the life sciences specifically. And I really would appreciate, Larry, if you could spend a few minutes in the temperature management arena. My question is, in a disrupted supply chain, how can temperature control containers provide a help for a farmer shipper and help them adapt processes without compromising their compliance?
Yeah, and that's been the nutshell of what's been necessary. So, in essence, what you're seeing now, as Edward was saying initially, you've got charters rather than scheduled flights. You're seeing the combis or the switchover from packs to cargo. It changes the whole game, and what we've seen for SkyCell is we've had to roll with those adjustments and make sure as we're going along the lines to see an accelerated implementation. So if you're going to stay GDP compliant, which in this game you have to, you also have to have those processes in place. And fortunately for us, we've always operated inside of the blockchain along with IoT sensors and to map our points. So what we are able to do in this process, and what we would recommend everybody do, is really talk through what the lane requires as it changes. So you'll have to be able to hit the points as you go along that supply chain. So it won't be enough to just say it's going to go from Argentina to Dubai or whatever the route. You need to be able to look at what those options will be, where some of the pain points could be along the way, tarmac time, are they handling with cool dollies and so on and so forth. If it's going to be on a carrier that requires cargo screening, how are you set up for that? All of the facets, but more than anything, you have to talk that through with all the providers in the supply chain. It's not enough if in this day and age to just say, hey, you know, we provide the container and we put it in that condition, and then you guys take it from there. You really have to dig in. So for us, what's been great and what we see is the professionals out there, whether they're companies like Tucker, where it's where you have the trucking management, or whether it's the colleagues here, DB Schenker or Kuninaga along the way, that you're talking through what a shipment needs to be. You have to map all those points, and in our case, we make sure for GDP compliance to do that in advance, but also to monitor it through. So, so one of the things I would say for anyone shipping, there's always been the need for sensors. We build them into our containers, but for those that are shipping without that benefit, make sure you have your sensors. And if you need to spend a little more to get more advanced sensors, perhaps during this time, it's a worthwhile get, because the priority that pharma has always had is not the same right now. The flights are not going with schedules. Container equipment does not necessarily take the priority that it did prior to COVID. And what we're seeing is that sometimes freight is being pushed on a day or being pushed out a day or taking a route that was not originally planned. And if you're able to map that through, then you're going to be able to adjust and think on the fly. But it's really critical that you work with your third-party providers and fourth-party providers, if the case, and really go for outside-the-box thinking and make sure that you're staying within GDP compliance. Just because of all of these situations, it doesn't mean that you should tolerate excursions or deviations. So more than anything, when you're looking through your supply chain, the key really is map it out, talk with other providers, don't make any assumptions that it's just going to go and everything's going to be fine. Monitor what you can monitor and invest in technology.
Very good. We'll come back to you with some follow-ups on how to do some of these things, but appreciate it, Larry. Laurent, now we're gonna go a little more detail into the impact on the carriers and related services. So let's start with this, Laurent. As the passenger aircraft cargo capacity, which was such a significant part of, as Edward talked about earlier, as it's expected to slowly be re-injected into the network, how is this going to influence access to temperature control infrastructure? How are you seeing that change?
Thanks, Joel. Good to be here. I hope everybody also in the audience and the panelists are well and stay safe. So, Joel, you mentioned a good topic. I spent the past decade, half of the past decade, working for a leading carrier in the space. So I have gained some in-depth insight into one of the most hidden parts of our logistics execution world, which happens at airports, at cargo hubs. Now, the COVID situation has impacted the infrastructure quite severely. Some of you might have heard that cargo handlers that actually handle the cargo before it gets to the airplane and after it comes off on an airplane, their staff was impacted by COVID. So some of the staff calling in sick, and also some of the staff, rightly so, being concerned with their health and well-being, or have not shown up for work. So airports like JFK had experience with it. I heard about Los Angeles. Some European cargo hubs experienced also a slowdown, especially at the beginning of the pandemic in March. And so that had a severe impact on access to facilities, because when there is no manpower, just as Jeff said, then there is nothing that we can do about that. So I'd like to like the audience to consider this perspective, what it means. So as we look into the future, and perhaps looking at a second wave or a third wave, or even this situation lingering on for longer, this could come back and hurt the supply chain and hurt the transportation chains. Now, also what we have seen in the past couple of weeks is, because there is less capacity from the carrier side, the belly capacity is technically gone, which accounted for 50–55% of all capacity. And so with that not being there, we have also seen a higher level of usage of the hub space, especially for the temperature controlled cargo. Now, we believe, and what I heard talking to industry experts, is that slowly, hopefully as of June, we will see an injection of belly capacity coming back in. Majority carriers are having some scheduled flights already published. So hopefully that will continue to come in throughout the rest of the year. And that will also have the effect that we will have more access to capacity. And again, all this infrastructure will come under more pressure. And one of the unintended consequences of the economical turndown certainly is that investments that were planned in the space are maybe postponed or certainly delayed for later. So these are some perspective to consider. And maybe another part of this equation is that, as Larry mentioned, the tarmac times that the healthcare cargo, the life sciences cargo spends is a crucial part of the transportation chain and the most vulnerable part of the transportation chain. So carriers have been very good, and also service providers have been very good in implementing procedures and solutions that extend the temperature integrity of the temperature sensitive goods. We have seen carriers implementing, and on the tarmac, implementing reflective foil usage into their processes, where active containers are not used or semi-active containers are not used, in order to flatten the temperature curve throughout the tarmac times. Now, if you look at a major airport, a major cargo airport, and what traffic goes through, just a benchmark, if you look at ATL, every 20 seconds there is an aircraft landing and taking off, which is a tremendous pressure on operation. So tarmac times are planned like a Swiss watch. And so if there is any delay or there is less frequency, as we believe it will happen, then those tarmac times could potentially be prolonged. And that also means that there's a prolonged exposure for cargo that is waiting to be loaded or waiting to be handled after it has been offloaded. So I think one of the key solutions that I want the audience to think about is to ensure and review what kind of thermal packaging are you using in order to protect temperature integrity of your freight. And if you are not or have not been using temperature controlled or temperature protective packaging, possibly this is a good time to think about it, because as the capacity that we've seen throughout 2019 and early 2020 is not likely to come back. And I also agree here with the points that Edward mentioned, is not likely to come back in the next 2 to 4 years. And with that, you are going to see extended tarmac times, and that could possibly mean also increasing potential for deviations. So also Larry hit on a good point about deviation management. So insights into what's happening on the tarmac, insights into what's happening throughout the transportation chain will be increasingly crucial. So temperature sensitive and monitoring devices will be key.
Great points. We're going to go to the roundtable section of the agenda, where we have some prepared questions, but having a little technical difficulty, not able to get any of the chat window information. But I do have some prepared things to put up for the panel. One that has come up is, what are the current and future options on co-chartering? Any of you want to comment on that one?
I think co-chartering, I mean, it certainly could be a solution, but I think what we have to remember is the fact that, as with anything where you're trying to do something with someone else, you're both going to have to align schedules. You're both going to have to come to an agreement in advance on how much person A versus person B is going to take. And then at the same time, you have to then work together through the intermediary in order to get to the charter itself. So there's a lot of things that have to work very well in that regard. It doesn't mean that it couldn't. It's just, historically, you know, we've seen issues where either you can't get shipment flows or shipments ready at the same exact time, or you go down the road where the organization's quality would say we can't co-load. And that would even go back to, you know, even the trucking aspect, even outside of just air freight itself. So we're not saying it can't happen, but there's a lot of hurdles that are going to have to be overcome to get it to happen.
Yes, anyone else want to cover that one?
Actually, I would like to add to what Edward said, and it's not only the fact that the timing needs to be matched in sequence, it's also, I think, the temperature requirements that cargo may have. And again, I go back to the temperature sensitive packaging. Some aircrafts have restrictions into and to what extent they can control the temperatures in the cargo holds and on board. So we might also run into challenges of temperature compatibility.
Great point. How about the regulations side of this equation, and not just co-chartering, but just you may have heard the term co-opetition, or the need for within industry cooperation. How are any of you seeing this as being an area that we need to look at more closely? Is this happening now? Has there been more cooperation, or are there still a lot of barriers?
So I'll just, from what we know, the EU has been very restrictive as far as their regulation in co-chartering and co-dealing between big pharma, just because there is a lot of sensitivity around data privacy, how that information is shared, so yes, the regulations, I would say, are some, the legal aspect and the non-competition, aspect of the regulations really restrict a lot of those exercises. And I agree with Edward and Laurent. From a temperature control and a quality release aspect, there's a lot to be done to be able to, co-charter, let's say, to, some of the restricted trade lanes. So yes, definitely check with your, your ship to, country. Check on your, where your shipment actually, starts. There are very strict regulations, so make sure that you're fully compliant and that your procurement and legal departments are fully involved.
Great point. Yeah, next question is, as the situation is not expected to improve anytime soon, non-essential goods shipments are expected to further tighten up, and the air freight market is going to really be affected. So how can service providers support the pharma industry in prioritizing cargo space on high impact trade lanes? Anything we can do?
Yeah, I think that there's a number of things, and it kind of goes back to the point I was mentioning before. There's a unique opportunity in this entire disruption, specifically to the air freight industry. And it may come down, you could apply the same metrics as well, potentially to the trucking industry at some point as well. But the opportunity is there where you've got now providers. And when I say the term provider, I'm talking about airlines, right? They are not just desperate for revenue, but they want consistent revenue. And so what we've seen a lot of, as some of the airlines have been reintroducing flights here and there, is they'll reintroduce a flight, and if they don't get something hooked into it, they pull it right back out and they put it on another trade lane. So if the shipper is willing to kind of throw out the old rule, which was, for the last 8-10 years, the term MQC, right, minimum quantity commitment, was considered an ugly term in the shipper world. This is actually a valuable term when you think about it now, because if a shipper is willing to say, here's the deal, I know I've got a consistent amount of flows, and I'm willing to say that I will take X amount of PMC space on a flight, X number of flights per week, you keep that plane in there, I'll commit this to you. It would give the assurity to that shipper, as well as a term we've used a little bit, which is called a baseload shipper. In theory, it would give them the actual lower cost amount because they're giving that commitment back to the airline. So I think that in this upheaval, there is that opportunity to really bring back that MQC mentality and use that for stability in rates and capacity. I don't know, Jeff, I mean, what do you think from a truck perspective?
I think, yeah, I think that what you were utilizing the moment is to try to get carriers so I should step back. I'm talking trucking, but we're a non-asset-based broker. We're the oldest privately held broker, freight broker in the U.S. So we've never owned a truck in nearly 60 years. So we have been on a path toward getting 100% of our truckloads electronically tracked, digitally tracked, GPS tracked. We're at 94% and change right now. So we're utilizing this time because we, as you say, not only airline carriers, everybody who's in business, the railroads, nobody has enough freight right now. So conversations that could not have been had just even 3 months ago about quality and commitment and partnershiping can be had now. And we're utilizing that to our advantage. So within trucking, it can be capacity commitments. It could be willingness to provide the GPS tracking where that has been, for whatever reason, not always popular among the trucking companies to give that to shippers. So whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish as a shipper, as the cargo owner, you've got willing audiences, I believe, in all of the modes of transportation right now.
Fantastic. Anyone else comment on that?
I wanted to add some color to the comments that Edward made. I think a perspective that I want us all to consider is that if you look at the major route, first of all, the capacity, the belly capacity, which is about 50% or 55% of all available capacity in the market, was at least, that was highly driven by passenger demand. So flights, for example, between, let's say, major hubs such as Frankfurt and JFK, Frankfurt or Atlanta, the flight frequencies were, for the passenger aircrafts, were designed by passenger demand. And we had the benefit in the cargo space to operate on those aircrafts. Now, they diminished, they gone. The last stats I heard, the passenger traffic is back to the levels of the 50s, 1950s. And that means 1% of passenger capacity or demand is there actually today. So that's a huge gap. So even if airlines will, as I said, maybe as of June, reconsider to re-inject some of that passenger belly capacity in the market, it's not going to be in a way that we have seen in the past. So maybe it's going to be a frequency of once, twice, or 3 times a week. So to the point of Edward, I think in times of crisis, we have a great opportunity to use the power of collaboration. And indeed, the more transparency we can provide upstream or downstream to subcontractors and the industry members, then they will be happy to listen, because this will help them maybe to reconsider how they construct their networks.
Very good. Yeah, next area on temperature management. I'm ad-libbing a bit here, but I think it's important for us to have this conversation because so much of our, in life sciences, so much of our air freight is moving passive, but we can address both active and passive packaging protection. When you have this much variability, airport to airport, and pointing towards Larry, Laurent, and Edward, what are you guys seeing, near term on how they're mitigating some of these significant, backlogs, transit time changes, those types of things? How are we solving these things? Because it's a serious issue right now.
Well, from our perspective, we're seeing that the equipment is not necessarily being honored by the airlines at this time. So the traditional moves, either the capacity isn't there, they've taken that flight out, as Laurent and Edward were saying before, and therefore you have to look at what you're doing. So what's important is that you have, for a container provider, that you have sourcing. You're able to have the right volume and the right mixture of your packaging to offer to the customers, to the pharma customers, so that they are able to meet the needs. So you're not going to want to make an arrangement that's outside the box at this time. So you're not going to fly equipment from here to there just to get it for a shipment, because it's just not going to work. So you have to have that capacity already to meet and roll with those changes. Jeff, during this time, for example, we needed to take some stock out of our facility in Ontario, Canada, and they were able to do something over a holiday weekend and keep it still, and which is vitally important to us, with all the records and the temperature settings, and in particular for all the compliance issues. But again, going back, the key here is the collaboration. As Laurent said earlier, these are the times really where your providers and the shippers have to collaborate and make sure that they're all following that pharma chain. And the key is that it's a pharma chain. It's not, you're not moving widgets. You really have to stay within compliance.
And your investment in partnerships is so vital in these times.
Most definitely.
If I can just throw one other thing out there to possibly think about, which is if you end up with less point-to-point flights, it means that you're adding in longer transit times at some point to some of these destinations, whereby you may have been able to transition from an active solution to a passive solution. But if it becomes much more challenging to get that passive solution within a certain period of time without either opening the package, without either having to put it into a temp controlled environment, you may find shippers have to regress back to active solutions for some of those types of moves. So it may be something that really the pharma healthcare industry may have to relook at how they've mapped this out over the last 5 years and see where they may have to revert back to some of their previous operational decisions.
And temperature mapping data that they have to go back to, because some of these things haven't been experienced since, post 9/11 and some of the other, so they have to go back and revalidate different trade routes. And to your earlier point, transshipments, if you're dealing with shipping to an area and then you have a different last mile, you have to remap that entire thing. I'd be interested to see if anyone has any experience in that they can talk about, if not on this call, offline, because I think it's important that some of these things, I would feel better in the industry if we share some of these challenges, because they're not necessarily proprietary. They're common pains. So as we get to the next question, I just want you to be thinking. Now I do have my chat window working, so I can cover some different questions. But my last kind of main prepared question that y'all had a chance to look at is, how will COVID-19 impact the shipping industry of the future? I think it's a great question, both from the LSP, service provider perspective, from the airline perspective, from various shipping lines. What are you seeing the future hold? And anyone can step in on these.
I think, I've always said these things run in cycles, right? So if anybody goes back to their management class from college, they talked about various philosophies that have come around in time. And we went from a TQM to a just in time, and we now have a new term, just in case. So I think we're going to somewhat regress back to a little bit of that TQM, where quality, safety stock, and inventories will come back. And I think over the long term, I believe obviously, what's taken place has really resonated in the C-suites. You will look at how this will really bring into case nearshoring or secondary nearshoring, where you may have a supplier that sits in the Far East, but you're at least sourcing 20 to 40% of that same supply from another supplier in a completely different region. So I think you're going to watch this entire trend change.
I think jumping to that as well. So we're seeing you, and it somewhat answers, Joel, your prior question as well to think about. What we're seeing too is the more traditional active/passive model is not holding up quite as well as what we're seeing. Those of us in the hybrid field, if you will. There's more flexibility, there's more data, the equipment is significantly newer, so there's less risk associated, and you need to, at this point, be risk averse. So somewhere where a changing or shifting supply chain, you may have to either go for a longer runtime, or you may have to go for something more flexible, and those that can give predictive analytics and work through all the specifics, the longer run times, etc. That really helps that supply chain and helps the farmer shipper and the 3PLs through this process. We've even seen the airlines. We've had multiple charters for our own products, various vaccines going here and there, where the airlines have not even accepted to move active containers at this time in favor of other products or other mixes. Yeah, so again, the hybrids have a bit of an advantage here. They're a bit more technologically up to date. They give a bit more flexibility in how you move. And the key then is to provide those solutions to the customer so that they can have those options.
Yeah, it's a valid point, Larry, and it goes back to basic packaging systems. You know, when you validate your systems, how robust. At the very core, it's not just the temperature extremes, it's your time duration. And if you can't put product in the right temperature interim, if you can't re-ice your passive packaging, if you can't plug in your active container, you know, I mean, it goes for all different, you know, including hybrid. If you can't, you know, there is a time limit on all of these things. And when you get with transshipments, you know, we all are the emperor claiming they have plenty of clothing, but in reality, it's not that way, you know. It brings us back to that point where these are common problems across industry that we have to address collectively in the right kind of partnership across the different levels of service. So with that, I'm going to go. I did want to, Jeff, I did want you to talk about the future a little bit on that. What are you seeing in the trucking industry near term and long term? How are we adapting?
The trucking industry, I believed most of my career, is a very adaptable thing. It just takes a while. So what I mean by that, we had a massive capacity shortage in 2003 to 5. It took 16 months for the industry to normalize. We had a polar vortex in 2016, I believe, 14. That took only 6 months or so to normalize the industry. Then, of course, we had 2018 that took about 16 months to normalize. That was when electronic logging devices came in, right? So what we're in now is uncharted waters. This is biblical. This is epic. So the question, you know, really is, you know, how long is it going to take? I believe, as I said earlier, I believe that the impact that we're all going to feel, and it doesn't matter if your company uses small, medium, large size carriers, the marketplace is the marketplace. If we lose a lot of owner operators right now and some large carriers and some mid-sized carriers, that brings capacity down. And if business begins to ramp back up later this year, even next spring, we've got we've got major problems. So what I'm hoping happens this time around, what I'm hoping is that, you know, shippers, large shippers don't say, hey, you know, well, big, we like to deal with big, and we're going to start consolidating our freight with our big asset-based guys, because that's what they've done every single time in the past. And then what happens is as the capacity starts picking up, or I'm sorry, tightening, and business starts coming, those guys, those carriers leave them at the altar, and you know, and stock prices get slammed because freight budgets are over, way over, and sometimes multiple times over what they were supposed to be. So and what I feel incredibly passionate about is that these owner operators, the small carriers, are the lifeblood of this industry. They are what makes this industry. They're what makes this industry as fluid as it is. I'm not sure. Looks like Katya Martins might be off of mute.
Please mute. I don't know how that happened.
But yeah, so I'm hopeful that we get to do a lot more collaboration and work on some really interesting things together with shippers. I'm cautiously optimistic we don't fall back to our evil ways and set ourselves up for massive price increases because we've wiped out too much capacity by not carefully spreading our eggs.
We're getting close to the top of the hour, so we're going to do our wrap up now. I apologize to those. I think we covered most of the areas that I saw out there. But first, I want to thank the panelists for taking the time. This has been very valuable. A reminder to the attendees that this event has been recorded and that it's going to be available very soon for anyone that's registered to be able to access on the BSMA website. But with that, I'd like to thank you for your time today. Really appreciated all the questions that came out there and tremendous answers, and looking forward to continuing this series sometime in the future. With that, I'll conclude this and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.